Good evening. Welcome to the Thursday evening update on Tropical Depressions 13. This is 14, excuse me, and this is 13 here. Both of these are expected to affect land masses, so buckle up. We're going to talk about 14L first. Here is 14 as the sun went down. You can see that the storm is far better organized today. You can see evidence of a circulation somewhere in here. The low-level circulation is actually very weak right now, very poorly defined. However, the mid-level circulation is quite the contrary. And you kind of have several areas of vorticity in this general patch here to the immediately under this mid-level circulation here, and there's a lot of just general vorticity in this area, so it's not really too tight right now. Looks can be deceiving, and this is not very the convection in this area is not very potent, and so right now it is organized in the mid-levels, but it is not very organized in the lower levels, and that is what we need in order for the storm to strengthen substantially here. If we look at the water vapor imagery, you can tell convection is kind of anemic this evening and will likely kind of gradually fill in here. There's evidence of banding structures in this system and what is kind of the beginning of a well-defined tropical cyclone. If you look at the feathery clouds expanding out of the storm here, you can see very clearly the upper level anticyclone that is helping aid all of this convection that you are looking at, and this is going to be in place over the next couple of days as this continues to the west. And one thing to note here, if we go back to the true color loop and the visible shot, is that this is going to be tracking very close to, if not onshore, to Honduras and Nicaragua here. And what that has tended to do in the past for storms that are tracking this close to the coast here, it will allow for the storm to tighten up and you can really get a more well-defined circulation in here. And what that will do is allow the storm to stack and have two well-defined circulations practically on top of each other here, and that would lead to strengthening in this region. You can see this is a very favorable environment that it is in. There's not a lot of shear. If you go back to the water vapor imagery, you can tell outflow is expanding out on all quadrants of the system. This is extremely favorable for intensification here, and you can see, if you look under the cloud layer here, you can see that the air in the Western Caribbean is much more moist, and the relative humidity values are deeper and overall more moist in this region. Recon also found evidence of that deep moisture layer off to the northwest. One thing to note is that the ship's intensity model forecast also has this intensifying rather quickly. It gives it a 58% chance of rapid intensification over the next 3 days and a rapid intensification event of 65 knots over the next 72 hours. We'll see if that happens. It would have to develop a well-defined inner core here, and that may take some time. It will be aided by these geographic processes that tend to help storms develop when they are passing close to this kind of bend in the coast here. This kind of favors the turning will turn back into the storm, and so you can have a tightening up of the circulation here. And so that's one thing that we need to be watching for. As far as the future of the system goes, well, the GFS has been a little more generous to the storm as of late. We'll talk about 13L here in a minute, but the GFS per the next 36 hours has this developing and actually has the storm a little stronger than it did yesterday, and there's been a couple runs that the GFS has actually made. There's a pretty strong storm in here, and the storm would tend to favor a track to the north. As you can see, the trough mid-level flow here, you can see it is largely out of the south and west. That also creates a shearing vector that is implemented upon the storm, and you can see that here as the storm is kind of stretched out in this run of the GFS, and it is pulled to the north and east and is not really allowed to get too strong. However, the shear will abate as this trough, you can see the mid-level flow backs off to the north here, and the mid-level flow immediately on top of the storm is actually pushed more out of the south and east. And so that will allow the storm to better align itself, and shear will largely abate in this region. And you can see the storm will respond to the lack of shear in this region with, intensification here. One of the problems, though, that it may encounter is this large swath of dry air to the south, and we'll see how that actually affects the storm. There's been a lot of confusion and kind of inconsistency regarding the models and intensity with the system. Remember, yesterday the GFS didn't even have a system here, and now the GFS has a pretty strong tropical storm in here heading towards the Texas coast. But there's a lot of uncertainty. If you look at the this is the 5-day forecast track here, you have a pretty large swath of coast here stretching from the Corpus Christi area all the way to the Mississippi Delta here. This is 5 days out. You've got plenty of time to figure this out, but if you are in these regions, you do need to have a plan in place just in case this does indeed come up towards your area and is actually strong. Right now, we're more concerned about this time slot here in the storm's track and how strong it is able to get, and there is potential for this to become strong and much stronger than what is forecast here. The National Hurricane Center, in their discussion, has hints of maybe it becoming a hurricane prior to making landfall on the Yucatan Peninsula. And another thing that I want to look at is the H-Wharf model run here and what this ends up doing. So if we're gonna go back to around 6 hours, where we have the mid-level circulation here in the mid-level flow that you can see very clearly. You have wind barbs that are pretty circular here, and that is evident on satellite imagery. If we go back to that, you can see the mid-level circulation is far more vigorous than the lower-level circulation, and that is represented well on the H-Wharf model run, as we don't really have a whole lot of closed isobars in the lower levels, and so that would mean that the storm is not exactly strong all the way down to the surface. And so pretty much what the H-Wharf does is, as this gets closer to the land, you can see here is Honduras and Nicaragua here, and here is the mid-level circulation right here, and you can see that a surface low kind of gradually develops here, and you can see it closes off and closes off some more, and as this kind of begins to get stacked, this is going to take a little bit. Once it does stack, H-Wharf does bring this up to a high-end tropical storm here as the mid-level and lower-level circulations are stacked. And once that happens, this would be able to strengthen some. And it ultimately depends on where exactly this occurs, because in a weaker kind of gyre of sorts, if we go back here, you have a large area of overall vorticity and a mid-level circulation, and what ultimately will decide where exactly this is and where this will form is ultimately where the mid-level circulation does track here. So if the mid-level circulation tracks a little further to the north or a little further to the south, that would ultimately dictate where the surface circulation forms. And so any slight deviation in track here would bring it a little further to the north here into Cozumel, or a little further to the south here near Belize. And that plays a big role in how much land interaction this ultimately has going forward, because the H-Wharf here has this interacting with land for a little while and tracks it across most of the Yucatan Peninsula in here, and it actually just completely kills off the system and destroys the mid-level circulation here. We'll see if this changes at all. I believe this will change, and the National Hurricane Center seems to agree that this intensity forecast is likely too much, but too much weakening over land, because a weaker storm and a weaker surface circulation and mid-level circulation would tend to go further to the west here, but a stronger system would tend to go more to the north here. And so we kind of just have to combine the overall conditions and what this may end up doing. Really, it depends on how fast this is able to wrap up and how fast this is able to intensify here. And there's a lot of uncertainty within that next kind of 36 to 48 to maybe 54 hours here, where this is still in the Western Caribbean. After that, there's not really a whole lot of potential for this to get much stronger, because the environment is kind of just moderate to unfavorable, and so it wouldn't allow for substantial strengthening in the Gulf. However, it is always important to watch something that ends in the Gulf here. And all right, anyway, let's get on to Tropical Depression 13 here. This is a very messy system today, and there has not been a whole lot of organization. Recon went in, and see if we can get an update on this. Has not really found a center here that is very coherent. We kind of just have a very broad kind of ellipse of sorts in here. We have winds out of the southeast on the northeast side, and kind of general turning on the northern side, and then back to the kind of just, it's not really too organized right now, and it's debatable as to whether or not this even has a center at this point. Go back to the true color loop here. Credit goes to Tropical Tidbits for these loops, by the way. You can see that the storm has been struggling with dry air all day, and the mid-level circulation is well displaced to the south here. You see the lower level circulation is racing out ahead of this, and you have a mid-level circulation that is further to the south and east. And so that prevents really any significant organization over the next several hours and a couple of days here. And if we go to the water vapor loop of the Atlantic, this is the tropical depression here, and you can see why this is happening. You have a trough that has dug in, and you have flow that is generally pushing the mid-level. There's mid-level flow that is pushing this circulation to the south of the lower level circulation, which is preventing it from being stacked. You really want, in order for a storm to intensify, you really want a storm to be stacked here. And this will continue over the next couple of days as this continues on to the west-northwest here and tracks closer to the islands. Regardless of how strong this gets, this will likely be some sort of a significant weather event for Puerto Rico and the northern Leeward Islands here. Do be watching this and expect heavy rain and maybe some gusty winds on the southern side of this system as it passes. But this trough should back away here, and we're really expecting this to happen, and the flow will largely not be shearing flow by the time it reaches over here and just to the north of the Dominican Republic, somewhere in there. But it ultimately depends, that future beyond this dash here ultimately depends on how organized this remains while it is passing through the Eastern Caribbean, because right now it's in pretty unfavorable conditions, and there's a lot of dry air and there's a lot of shear that is hurting the system. It's not overwhelmingly unfavorable, but it is unfavorable and has prevented the storm from really, becoming organized today, and will likely prevent it from becoming organized later on. However, let's look at the H-Wharf model. Kind of went ahead here. And the H-Wharf model has recon data from the storm, the recon mission that we just got today. And you can see the H-Wharf model does not really have this really too well organized here. You can see the mid-level moisture bubble off to the north and east of the supposed kind of axis of sorts here. This isn't really well organized at all. And quite frankly, there's not a whole lot of a pressure gradient in here. and this is not really well organized, period. And you can see this kind of turns back to the south here. You have the mid-level vortex of sorts here, and then you have the lower level vortex, and this is largely due to the shifting of the shear vector here. The shear vector right now is largely out of the northwest, and this will change to being out of the north, then to being out of the northeast, and then to being out of the east as this moves around this upper level low. And really you want, if a storm is moving off to the north and west or west-northwest, you want the shear vector to be aligned with the overall movement of the system, so that would allow for the system to strengthen some. And we don't really get that until much later. And you see a surface low tries to develop here, but the shear vector becomes northeasterly. And so you have a surface low here that is to the north of the Dominican Republic, but you have your mid-level vorticity is located to the south and west of the system. So this prevents any substantial organization, albeit there will be some organization according to the HWRF model and some other intensity models, but this will be slow to organize over the next several or couple of days here as this moves to the north of the Greater Antilles. How close this actually does get to the Greater Antilles will ultimately determine its kind of final intensity as it is nearing the Florida coast and nearing the Bahamas. And there's a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity regarding the forecast track. And you can see the National Hurricane Center has this kind of just moving. It has shifted further to the north, and you can see that Cuba and the Dominican Republic are less and less in the cone. If you're outside of the cone, you do need to be watching this as well, as this may shift. This cone may shift a little bit to the south here, and may shift a little bit to the north. It depends on the intensity of the storm. Once it gets past this point here, because the shear should kind of slow down a little bit, and the shear vector will abate and will actually push the mid-level circulation back into the storm. If we go a little further, you can see the mid-level circulation down here, and you have the surface low that is still removed from the mid-level circulation. But as the shear vector turns back out of the south and east, which is more in line with the storm motion here, you can see how fast this is able to regroup. And this is actually quite a jump in the hours because there are some frames missing here. So it'd be really nice to have these frames, but there isn't. And between 66 hours and 81 hours out, you have a complete reorganization of the storm, and it is able to intensify quicker here, because keep in mind that these waters in the Bahamas and in the northwestern Caribbean are pretty warm and would favor intensification that is very quick here. And you see how close this is to Cuba, though? If it is a little further to the south, it would not be as strong. If it is a little further to the north, it would be able to, stay away. There's not much of a room for error here. And if it is a little further to the south, we may not be dealing with something that is, at this level. And if it's a little further north, maybe it will be able to strengthen a little faster here. And again, positioning, you can't really forecast that to a T when it's still more than 3 days out. And you can see the HWRF has this continuing to strengthen here as it approaches the Florida Straits and maybe the eastern Florida coastline here. Again, this model is not known for track. This is largely known for intensity, and it does have recon data that has gone into this run, so you should be taking this a little more seriously. But this storm is able to regroup and strengthen rather quickly here upon approach to the Florida Straits. And that is something that is pretty concerning. So if you live, and let's go back to the 5-day cone here, if you live along this area that has been coned effectively, You still have about 4 days before this is in your area, but you do need to be preparing before the crowds and everything. Be sure to get a plan in order and continue to watch the National Hurricane Center for the latest regarding the system. There's a lot to figure out here, and there's still a lot of uncertainty, and we don't have a lot of time because of how fast this is moving, and so it would be nice of you to go ahead and get ready for this while it is still out here in the central Atlantic before it enters the Caribbean here. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.